I want to start by thanking the university for inviting me and having me here, as I've found it is always best to start by thanking your hosts. That is, if you want to be invited back. Given that we are only a few days away from the 160-year anniversary of the Battle of Fort Sumter, and thus the opening of what's called the American Civil War, I think this is a great time to have a thoughtful and reflective discussion about this topic that is so heavily discussed and yet so deeply misunderstood. I'm also fond of saying that as an institution, Washington and Lee University is a very fitting expression of our nation's complicated history. After all, one of the people it's named after was a Virginian slave owner and prominent general who took up arms against his own country, effectively committing treason to fight for a cause the success of which would lead to the prolongment of the institution of slavery. And the other person is Robert E. Lee. My cheeky description of George Washington is, of course, based on the fact that the British Empire abolished slavery nearly 30 years before we Americans did. And thus, if we had remained loyal to the crown, slavery almost certainly would have been abolished here sooner. And so, not only do Robert E. Lee and George Washington share a number of relevant attributes and engaged in very similar behaviors for uncomfortably similar reasons, but the real-life effects of their efforts are also the same. They are both so-called traitors to their countries, leading a rebellious cause to form a new country that would prolong the institution of slavery. So why is one still a hero, and the other currently suffering from an all-out character assault and attempted wholesale cancellation? For all intents and purposes, Washington and Lee share virtually identical legacies in terms of their most defining traits and actions. In the annals of history, they're essentially the same person. So why the drastic difference? And here is where I kindly ask that you join me for what will be for many of you an unsettling and discomforting examination of the events surrounding what we call the American Civil War amidst the backdrop of U.S. history in its totality. I have no doubt that others up here on this stage will disagree or take issue with the points I will make this evening, and that's well and good. After all, that is why we are here. We've been invited to participate in a discussion about the causes and meaning of the Civil War and how the event fits into the broader context of the American story. I, for one, don't enjoy relitigating the specifics of the Civil War, and so I kindly ask for patience, even from those who do not take my position for their own, because I've deliberately left time in the second half of my remarks to make broader comments about our nation in general. I'm more interested in where we are going as a country as opposed to where we've been, though both are important. And so even if you find yourself rolling your eyes and biting your tongue, we might be able to find a modicum of agreement on the back end. I am not here to convert anyone. I only hope to cause people to think about this topic from a different perspective and in a broader context, and maybe even find a few new questions of their own. And no, I am not self-promoting a book for sale. In the academic world of publish or perish, it seems I've opted for the latter. I fully suspect that my position is not currently the popular one, but just because my argument is not popular at this time does not mean it is wrong. Just look at the advocates for the abolition of slavery here in the United States. Their position was not always popular either. And just because I am going to highlight facts that are inconvenient and often go ignored in today's society because they call into question the mythology we have concocted around the Civil War does not make those facts any less true. As they say, sometimes the truth just hurts. And the truth is that over the past several decades, we in academia and others in our society writ large have been manufacturing an embarrassingly oversimplified, feel-good fable about the Civil War that depicts the righteous prevailing over the wicked, built around a selective retelling of events as well as a deliberate forgetting of certain facts. It is a fable that includes both positive and negative exaggerations of both sides' chief players and even the rank and file. It is a very effective myth that has implanted itself firmly into our society, and it does what every good myth does. It helps us cope emotionally with a difficult topic by shielding us from uncomfortable realities. It gives us false heroes to praise, and more importantly, it gives us false villains to blame. My intent is to expose this fable, and the best way to do it is to start by saying some blunt words that might be jarring to the ears. The reality is this: the Civil War was not a war about slavery. The truth is, it could not have been only about slavery. In fact, it is illogical to assert that the Civil War was strictly or even mostly about slavery. After all, how can we earnestly state that a conflict between two sides was solely about the practice of slavery when both sides were actively practicing slavery within their own borders for the duration of the entire conflict? The slave states in the Union were Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri, for those of you keeping score. Of course, the Southern Confederacy had more slaves than the Union had, but if the Civil War really was truly about the issue of slavery, why didn't those Union slave states secede from the Union and join the Confederacy? Perhaps more critically, if the Union is fighting solely to abolish slavery, why didn't they invade those slave states and free their slaves? It's as though you witnessed a drunken brawl between 10 men. On one side, all 5 are smoking cigarettes, while on the other side, only 2 are smoking cigarettes. And then, after it was over, you concluded with absolute conviction that they must have been fighting strictly about the efficacy of cigarette smoking. One side was totally for it, and the other side totally against it. And that's why they were fighting, even though both sides had smokers the entire time. Wouldn't you laugh at such absurd reasoning? And so, you should laugh at the absurdity of the illogical mess of mental gymnastics and intellectual amnesia that has come to be mainstream teaching about the Civil War. I'm afraid I am far from finished, but at least I've given you fair warning. Not only are both sides of the conflict actively engaged in the practice of slavery, but the commander-in-chief of the Union, that's Abraham Lincoln, by the way, stated repeatedly that he had no desire to abolish slavery. He's kind of a big player in all of this, for the record, and he famously put in writing in response to respected abolitionist Horace Greeley and had it published in the newspaper in the year 1862, a full year after the Confederacy had seceded and in the midst of the war. His oft-forgotten words of total moral equivocation were, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." Heroic and principled indeed. And this is not to diminish Lincoln's nobler traits, just merely repeating the overlooked words of the commander-in-chief of the Union stating, for the record in the newspaper for all to know, that the Civil War was not about slavery. We also have to somehow contend with the fact that Union General Grant, the guy who eventually defeated the Confederacy and accepted Lee's surrender, himself owned slaves through his marriage to his wife. And there's even correspondence in 1863, in the thick of the Civil War, where he stated clearly and on the record that he had, quote, never been an abolitionist, not even what one would call anti-slavery. So, not only does the Union have slaves within its own borders, its main general for the conclusion of the war had slaves and held no personal opposition to the institution. And the revered president of the Union, the, quote, great emancipator, has made it abundantly clear that his motivations have absolutely nothing to do with slavery. I, for one, love the Emancipation Proclamation, but probably not for the reason most people do. I love that document authored by President Lincoln because it provides a rare opportunity for us academics to give an exact statistic on something. Does anyone care to guess how many slaves were actually actively freed by the Emancipation Proclamation? The exact number is 0. That's right. Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation has wonderful words in it, but does not actually free any slaves, even though he had the power and authority to free hundreds of thousands of slaves within his own borders, and he chose not to. Believe it or not, it gets worse. The 13th Amendment is understandably well known because it abolished slavery. However, what almost nobody talks about, and for obvious reasons, is that the 13th Amendment almost preserved and guaranteed slavery as a constitutional right. If you've dismissed my remarks this evening to this point, then I kindly ask that you tune in here. Shortly after Lincoln's inauguration as president and as the Southern states were beginning to make their departure from the Union, there was an earnest effort by a coalition of congressmen and senators to ratify a constitutional amendment which would make the practice of slavery a constitutional right in the states currently engaged in the institution. It passed both houses of Congress with supermajority support, and Lincoln indicated that he would sign the bill before it would then have to go to the states for ratification. Not only that, Lincoln even sent copies of this amendment to each of the state's governors and said on the record that he had no objection to its being made express and irrevocable. You won't find this mentioned in any American history textbooks, I assure you, and yet it is completely, damningly true. Just as I imagine a majority of the people gathered here this evening are also completely unaware of this horrendously uncomfortable truth. I am referring to, of course, the so-called Corwin Amendment, named after Congressman Thomas Corwin, who was not a pro-slavery Democrat from the South, but rather a Republican from the non-slave state of Ohio. All of this merely echoed Lincoln's sentiment that slavery as an institution was not to be tinkered with, a position that was made an official part of the Republican Party platform for the 1860 election in which Lincoln prevailed. 5 states ratified the Corwin Amendment, all of which were Union states, and 3 of which were free states that did not practice slavery within their borders. Now, this is the moment where we really slay the dragon on both sides of the ledger, so to speak. After all, this reality lays bare for all to see. Not only that Lincoln has no issue with slavery, he and his administration and even some anti-slavery Republicans were willing to codify into the Constitution the right to continue practicing slavery in the slave states in perpetuity. What does this say about the Union cause? Well, it makes it perfectly plain that the Union cause has nothing to do with abolishing slavery. How could it? They just voted to make it a constitutional right. As for Lincoln himself, the current mythology insists that he was hostile to slavery. Right, he was so hostile to the institution of slavery that as President of the United States, he did everything in his power to make it an inalienable constitutional right. But what does all this say about the Southern Confederacy's cause? If the Southern Confederacy is solely interested in the preservation of the practice of slavery, well, this is akin to handing them a blank check. If slavery is the only issue motivating them to secede and leave the Union, why on earth didn't they just take this complete and total political victory and stay put? It sure would have made their lives a heck of a lot easier. Now, I am well aware that human beings are perfectly capable of acting against their own self-interest from time to time. However, it is also a prevailing trend throughout history for groups of people to constantly take the course of least resistance. And in this instance, taking the course of least resistance involves the Southern slave states accepting this impending constitutional amendment and remaining in the Union. I mean, you may not admire the Southern Confederacy's leadership, but I think you'd have to concede that Jefferson Davis and his fellow Confederates were not lunatics that had just escaped from an asylum. They were rational, self-interested individuals. And as such, if they were only interested in preserving slavery, why go through so much needless effort in seceding from the Union when they've just been given everything they could possibly want? The myth pushers often talk about this whole argument that the South was fighting for states' rights as merely code word for slavery. But I have to ask, why would the South have been coy about anything after a certain point? I mean, they've already left the Union, formed a new government and army, fired upon federal troops, and are even printing their own money. If they were solely fighting for slavery, what are they holding back for? When they sing, hurrah, hurrah for Southern rights, hurrah, why don't they just sing out, for slavery always, we love slavery? It may seem a low-brow question, but I am sincere with my inquiry. Why all this coded language about separation of powers if their intentions were so one-dimensional and their separation already underway? The argument by the slavery-only mythologizers is something along the lines of, well, when Lincoln said the war was not about slavery, he really meant that the war was about slavery. When Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and other Confederate leaders all cited the secession of their home states and the mobilization of federal troops as the reasons for siding with the South, what they really meant was that they hate the African race. I mean, what they've done is just eliminate these people's own words that were entered on the record and then filled in the blanks with whatever narrative they're pushing. In addition to this devastatingly inconvenient observation from the lead-up to the Civil War, we also have to contend with one at the back end of the conflict. Here's another thing you won't find mentioned in any textbooks: Black Confederates. And it's not because they didn't exist, and there could have been a lot more. In the final 6 months or so of the Civil War, the upper echelons of the Confederacy genuinely discussed and deliberated over the prospect of wholesale freeing their slaves, arming them, and training them to fight in the Confederate Army. Robert E. Lee supported this idea, as did Judah Benjamin, who was a Jewish non-slave owning member of Jefferson Davis's cabinet. You won't hear much about him either, I assure you, because he doesn't serve the narrative that this myth propagates. Ultimately, the Confederacy did not wholesale adopt this strategy in the closing months of the war, which likely saved thousands of soon-to-be-freed slaves' lives. But this presents a pretty glaring question. If the Southern Confederacy's sole point of existing was for the preservation of slavery, why on earth would they even consider the prospect of freeing slaves, much less giving them guns? Surely they still recall John Brown's failed slave rebellion a mere 5 years prior. There's another group of people I'd like to mention at this juncture, the Native Americans. There has been a lot of recent interest and sympathy for the Native Americans and their place in American history, but that all curiously pauses for the years 1861 to 1865. And not just because there was a lot going on at that time, although there obviously was. The Native Americans were very much involved in the Civil War. Guess which side they fought for? Yeah, you won't read much about this in the textbooks either, but 10 Native American tribes sided with the Southern Confederacy, including some big names like the Cherokee, Choctaw, Seminole, and Comanche. But this is despite the fact that some of these tribes did not practice slavery, and the ones who did had a comparatively tiny population of African slaves. This reality is enshrined by the fact that the very last Confederate troops to surrender were Cherokee, and yet there's curiously no effort underway to cancel or remove icons commemorating these tribes, despite their very blatant support for the Southern Confederacy. So, why did the Native Americans take up the Confederate cause? Could it be they had their own reasons other than slavery? Now, it is worth mentioning the very unsettling fact that had the Southern states not seceded, then slavery would have continued well past 1865 in this country. And so, if we find slavery to be an abominable practice that needed to be ended as soon as possible, well then we find ourselves having to applaud the secession of the Southern slave states. This is not to say the South seceded to end slavery, of course not. But the practical effect of their leaving brought about a quicker end to slavery. Had they not seceded, slavery undoubtedly continues for a few more decades, potentially into the 20th century even. And so, the bitter irony is that if you abhor slavery, then you must grudgingly celebrate the Southern states' decision to leave the Union. Strange bedfellows, indeed. And so, getting back to this myth that the Civil War was only about slavery, I commend my colleagues on this stage in advance for taking up such a Herculean task. I for one would hate to have to argue that the Civil War was about slavery in the midst of such horrendously inconvenient truths. I expect that we will hear from them a few nice quotes from Lincoln, as opposed to the not-so-heroic ones that I mentioned, or something about how the Civil War abolished slavery. So therefore, that must have been the main aim of the conflict. Except, of course, that the abolition of slavery was an effect of the Civil War, not a cause. Cause and effect are two distinctly different things. Just because the Civil War ended slavery does not mean that the Civil War was caused by slavery. This is like saying that if the Big Bang caused the planet Earth, then the planet Earth caused the Big Bang. It's illogical. Nobody else on this stage is likely to bring up any of the things I mentioned, and that is because they don't want to talk about such inconvenient truths. But neither will they be able to refute any of the facts I have mentioned so far tonight, because they are all true. My well-intended colleagues are likely to brush past some of my points in a sort of, well, yes, that's true, but besides that, again and again and again. It's as though you told your kids to do the dishes every day this week, and then at the end of the week they confidently stated, well, besides Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday, we did the dishes every day just like you said. I mean, can you imagine? Okay, we get it. Besides the fact that there were 4 slave states still in the Union, besides the fact that Lincoln specifically stated the war wasn't about slavery, besides the fact that even anti-slavery politicians in the Union were willing to ratify a constitutional amendment protecting slavery indefinitely, and despite the fact that the South still left the Union in spite of this offer, besides the fact that there were black Confederates and the South considered a wide-scale emancipation and arming of slaves to fight in their army, all the while, Lincoln is not emancipating hundreds of thousands of slaves within his own borders, despite the fact that the Native Americans have taken up the cause of the Southern Confederacy, despite very minimal interest in the institution of slavery. Yes, I concede, besides all of these things, if you remove all of these other details and hide them from view and suppress them, then yes, the Civil War is about slavery. I mean, either you did the dishes every day this week or you didn't. Either the Civil War is about slavery or it isn't, or it is about multiple issues, one of which could be slavery. I mean, could you imagine going to a mechanic and being told, well, besides the muffler, radiator, steering alignment, and that clunking sound you keep hearing, your car is perfectly fine? It's precisely the same logic, just boiled down at its simplest level. Except for all these exceptions, this here is the sole reason or explanation.